The alarm system screamed across every military facility on Kelthera Prime. Captain Mirith's three-fingered hands trembled as she watched the display screens fill with red markers. 30 enemy vessels had just appeared at the edge of their system, and they were moving fast toward the inner colonies. She had served in the Keltheran Defense Force for 20 years, but this was different. These weren't pirates or raiders looking for quick profits. The sensor data told a horrifying story. Each ship was massive, covered in organic armor and bristling with weapons. The Vrexian swarm had arrived, and they hadn't come to negotiate. Mirith activated the emergency channel to the defense fleet. Commander Torek's face appeared on her screen, his usually calm expression replaced by barely controlled panic. His fleet of 18 patrol ships was already moving to intercept, but both of them knew the truth. The Keltheran vessels were designed for peacekeeping and asteroid management, not warfare. They carried light weapons meant to disable pirate craft, not fight a full military invasion. The battle lasted 11 minutes. Mirith watched helplessly as the red markers on her screen systematically eliminated the blue ones. The Vrexian ships didn't even slow down. Their biological weapons ate through the Keltheran hulls like acid through paper. Their plasma cannons turned her people's ships into expanding clouds of debris. When it was over, all 18 vessels were gone. Torek's final transmission had been a simple apology to his family. The Vrexians split into 3 groups, each one heading toward a different colony world. Mirith knew what came next. She had read the reports from other systems the Vrexians had invaded. They would land their ground forces, overwhelm any resistance, and begin harvesting the population. The Vrexians didn't take prisoners or negotiate surrenders. They consumed everything organic they could find and moved on to the next system. She initiated the evacuation protocols. Across all 3 colonies, billions of Keltherans received the same message: get underground immediately. The colonies had extensive shelter systems built into their bedrock, designed to protect against asteroid impacts or solar events. They had never been meant to hide populations from invasion, but they were the only option now. The first colony fell within 6 hours. The second one held out for 9 hours before the Vrexian ground forces breached their primary shelter complex. Reports came in of harvesting operations beginning immediately. Mirith felt sick as she read the casualty estimates. Millions were already dead or captured. On Kelthera Prime, the largest of the 3 colonies, Mirith ordered all communications equipment brought into the central shelter. If they were going to die down here, she would at least try to warn other systems. The Galactic Council needed to know that the Vrexians were expanding their territory again. Lieutenant Katie Walsh, one of her junior officers, worked frantically at the communications console. The young Keltheran had only graduated from the academy 2 years ago. She had joined the Defense Force hoping for a career exploring distant star systems, not fighting for survival in an underground bunker. Katie looked up from her work with tears in her large eyes. Captain, I've sent warnings to all neighboring systems, but our communication arrays on the surface are being destroyed. We have maybe another hour before we lose all contact with the outside galaxy. Mirith made a decision. She ordered Katie to broadcast a general distress call on all frequencies, including the rarely used emergency channels that reached beyond their local sector. The message was simple and desperate. They were peaceful people under attack by the Vrexian swarm. They needed immediate assistance. Medical aid, evacuation support, anything. She included their coordinates and a brief description of their situation. The message went out across space, traveling at the speed of light in all directions. It would take time to reach anyone who might help, and time was something the Keltherans didn't have. But Mirith had to try. She had to believe that someone out there would hear their call and care enough to respond. What Mirith didn't know was that her distress call had been picked up by a listening post on the far edge of explored space. The station was relatively new, built by a species that most of the galaxy barely knew existed. Humanity had only made first contact with the Galactic Council 3 years ago, and they were still considered mysterious newcomers by the established civilizations. The human monitoring station immediately forwarded the distress call to Earth's military command. Within 30 minutes, Admiral Marcus Blake was reading the translated message in his office at the United Earth Defense Headquarters. He was a tall man with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that had seen too many battles. He had commanded Earth's defense forces through the early days of humanity's expansion into space, and he understood threats when he saw them. Blake called an emergency meeting of his senior staff. The conference room filled quickly with officers representing every branch of Earth's military. They reviewed the intelligence reports on the Vrexian swarm, which weren't encouraging. The Vrexians were known aggressors who had conquered dozens of systems over the past century. They were technologically advanced, numerous, and utterly ruthless. Commander Lisa Harper, one of Blake's most trusted officers, studied the tactical data with a frown. She was a career military officer who had grown up on Mars Colony and joined the Earth Defense Force as soon as she was old enough. Her analytical mind quickly assessed the situation. "Sir, according to our intelligence, the Vrexians have approximately 40 ships in that system now. They're conducting ground operations on 3 colonies simultaneously. The local defense force has been completely destroyed. If we respond, we're looking at a full combat operation, not a rescue mission." Blake nodded slowly. He understood what she was saying. The Keltherans had asked for humanitarian aid, for medical support and evacuation. They were expecting relief ships, not warships. But sending relief ships into an active war zone would be suicide. The Vrexians would destroy any unarmed vessels before they could help anyone. Another officer, Captain Jake Morrison, spoke up. He commanded the EDS Valkyrie, humanity's most advanced dreadnought-class warship. Morrison was younger than Blake, with dark hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had faced danger so many times it no longer rattled him. "We can't send a relief convoy into that situation," Morrison said, "but we can send the 7th Expeditionary Battle Group. We have 12 capital ships ready for deployment, including the Valkyrie. We can be at the Kelthera system in 4 days if we push our faster-than-light drives hard." Blake looked around the room at his officers. He saw determination in their faces, not hesitation. Humanity was still new to galactic politics, still learning how to interact with the dozens of alien species they had encountered. But one thing was absolutely clear in every human's mind. When someone sent a distress call asking for help, you answered it. The decision was made quickly. Earth would respond to the Keltheran distress call, but not with the relief convoy they expected. The 7th Expeditionary Battle Group would deploy immediately, with full combat authorization. Their mission was simple: eliminate the Vrexian threat and secure the safety of the Keltheran population. Blake authorized the deployment and then personally recorded a message to be sent to the Keltherans. He kept it brief. "This is Admiral Marcus Blake of the United Earth Defense Force. We have received your distress call and are responding. A battle group is en route to your location and will arrive in 4 days. Hold on. Help is coming." The message was transmitted immediately, racing across space at faster-than-light speeds through the communication relays. It would reach the Keltherans in approximately 3 days, giving them 1 day of warning before the human fleet arrived. On Kelthera Prime, conditions in the shelters were deteriorating. The Vrexians had landed ground forces on the surface and were systematically searching for the underground complexes. Every few hours, another section of the shelter network would go dark as the invaders broke through and began their harvesting operations. Mirith had long since given up hope of survival. She focused instead on keeping order in the shelters and making sure the civilians remained as calm as possible. Children cried for parents who had been on the surface when the attack began. Medical supplies were running low. The air recyclers were working overtime and starting to fail under the strain. Katie was still at the communications console, even though there was almost nothing left to communicate with. Most of their surface arrays were destroyed, and the remaining ones were being jammed by Vrexian signals. She was monitoring the emergency channels out of habit more than hope when she detected an incoming transmission. Her hands flew across the console, trying to clean up the signal. When she finally decoded it, she stared at the message in confusion before calling for Captain Mirith. The captain rushed over and read the message twice, not quite believing what she was seeing. Someone had answered their distress call. But the response wasn't from the Galactic Council or any of their neighboring systems. It was from a species called humanity, offering military assistance. The message mentioned a battle group which implied warships, not relief vessels. Mirith didn't know what to make of it. She had heard rumors about humans during her brief time at the Galactic Council headquarters years. 4 days felt like an eternity in the underground shelters. The Vrexians had breached 2 more shelter complexes, and the screams that came through the communication lines before they went silent would haunt the survivors forever. Captain Mirith estimated that nearly 40% of the Keltheran population on their colony was already gone. The other two colonies had gone completely silent 2 days ago. Lieutenant Katie Walsh hadn't slept in over 50 hours. She stayed at the communications console, desperately hoping to detect any sign of the help that had been promised. Most of the other officers thought she was wasting her time. The mysterious humans were probably just another species making empty promises, if they even existed at all. Then the sensors went crazy. Katie's console lit up with energy signatures unlike anything in the Keltheran database. Massive objects were appearing at the edge of the system, 12 distinct contacts emerging from faster-than-light travel in a perfectly coordinated formation. Each signature was enormous, suggesting ships far larger than anything the Keltherans had ever built. Her first terrified thought was that more Vrexians had arrived to finish the job. But the energy patterns were completely different. These ships used technology that didn't match any known species in the local sectors. Katie's hands shook as she routed the data to Captain Mirith's station. Mirith stared at the readings in disbelief. 12 massive warships had just appeared in their system, and they were moving fast, very fast. The acceleration rates she was seeing should have been impossible. The forces involved would crush any living crew under their own weight. Yet these ships were pulling maneuvers that defied everything the Keltherans knew about space travel. The lead ship was truly massive, easily 3 times the size of the largest Vrexian vessel. The sensor data identified dense armor plating, dozens of weapon systems, and power outputs that seemed absurdly high. This wasn't a relief convoy. This was a military fleet designed for one purpose: overwhelming force. An incoming transmission request flashed on Katie's console. She looked at Mirith, who nodded. Katie opened the channel, and for the first time the Keltherans heard a human voice. Keltheran forces, this is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Ship Valkyrie. We received your distress call and are responding. Please transmit your current status and the locations of all civilian shelters. We're here to help. The voice was strange, with different tonal qualities than Keltheran speech, but the translation software handled it well enough. What struck Mirith most was the calm confidence in Morrison's words. There was no doubt, no hesitation. Just a simple statement of fact. They were here to help. Mirith activated her microphone with trembling hands. Captain Morrison, this is Captain Mirith of Kelthera Prime. We have approximately 6 billion civilians in underground shelters across 3 colonies. The Vrexian forces control all surface areas and are systematically breaching our shelters. Our defense fleet was destroyed 4 days ago. We requested humanitarian aid and evacuation support, but I don't understand. You brought warships. There was a brief pause before Morrison responded. Captain Mirith, we understood your situation completely. You don't need evacuation right now. You need the threat eliminated. We're going to handle the Vrexians first, then we'll discuss humanitarian aid. I need you to keep your people in the shelters and away from the surface for the next 12 hours. It's going to get loud up there. Mirith wanted to argue, to explain that fighting the Vrexians was hopeless, that they should focus on saving whoever they could, but something in Morrison's voice stopped her. This wasn't bravado or foolish optimism. This was a professional military officer stating his operational plan with the same tone someone might use to discuss a routine supply delivery. Commander Lisa Harper's voice came through the channel next. Captain Mirith, we know you're scared and you've suffered terrible losses. But we need you to trust us. This is what we do. Stay in your shelters, keep your people calm, and let us work. We'll contact you again soon. The transmission ended, leaving Mirith staring at her console in confusion, and something that might have been hope. She ordered Katie to track the human fleet's movements and broadcast their instructions to all remaining shelter complexes. The civilians needed to know that help had arrived, even if none of them understood what kind of help it was. The human fleet split into precise formations as they accelerated deeper into the system. The Vrexian commanders detected the new arrivals and began calculating their response. By their assessment, 12 ships against their 40 was manageable, especially since they controlled all 3 colonies and could use the civilian populations as leverage if needed. The Vrexian fleet commander dispatched 30 ships to intercept the human force, keeping 10 in reserve around the colonies. It was a standard response to an unknown force, designed to test their capabilities while maintaining orbital control of the conquered worlds. The Vrexians had used this tactic successfully dozens of times against other species who had attempted to interfere with their operations. The 2 fleets approached, each other at speeds that made Katie dizzy just watching the sensor displays. The Vrexians opened their formation, preparing to envelop the smaller human force in a standard pincer movement. Their biological weapons were primed, their plasma cannons charged. They expected a brief fight followed by the systematic destruction of another foolish species. What happened next would be studied by military historians across the galaxy for decades to come. The human ships didn't slow down or attempt to negotiate. They didn't ask for surrender or try to establish communication with the Vrexians. They simply accelerated directly into the enemy formation at speeds that should have torn them apart. Then they opened fire with weapons the galaxy had never seen before. Katie watched her sensors in stunned silence as the first Vrexian ship simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, a massive organic construct bristling with weapons. The next moment it was expanding debris, torn apart by something that had hit it at a significant fraction of light speed. Then the second ship exploded. Then the third and fourth simultaneously. The human ships were firing solid projectiles accelerated to incredible velocities using magnetic fields. The concept was simple, almost primitive compared to energy weapons, but the sheer kinetic force involved was devastating. Each projectile carried more destructive power than a fusion warhead, and the humans were firing them in rapid succession. The Vrexians tried to return fire, but their weapons couldn't lock onto targets moving that fast and pulling such aggressive maneuvers. Their biological missiles were intercepted by a web of laser fire that seemed to anticipate every trajectory. Their plasma weapons hit only empty space where human ships had been milliseconds before. Mirith watched the battle through Katie's sensor feed, unable to believe what she was seeing. The Vrexians had seemed invincible, crushing the Keltheran fleet in minutes. But against the humans, they were the ones being crushed. 7 minutes after the first shot was fired, all 30 Vrexian ships were destroyed. Not damaged or disabled, destroyed, reduced to debris fields that would orbit the system for centuries. The human fleet hadn't even slowed down. They maintained their formation and continued toward the 3 colonies, now splitting into 3 separate task forces. The remaining 10 Vrexian ships around the colonies tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The human vessels were faster and more maneuverable. Morrison's voice came through the communication channel again. Captain Mirith, the orbital threat has been neutralized. We're beginning ground operations to eliminate Vrexian surface forces. This may take several hours. Please ensure your people remain in the shelters until we've secured the surface. Neutralized. As if 30 enemy warships were just a minor inconvenience that had been handled. Mirith tried to process what she had just witnessed. Her entire defense fleet had been obliterated in 11 minutes. The humans had destroyed a force 3 times that size in 7 minutes without taking any apparent damage. Katie was tracking something new on her sensors. The human ships were launching small craft toward the surface of all 3 colonies. These weren't shuttles or transport vehicles. They were drop pods, armored capsules falling through the atmosphere at speeds that would kill any Keltheran on impact. "Captain," Katie whispered, "they're dropping their soldiers directly into combat zones. They're not even slowing down. Those pods are hitting the surface at hundreds of meters per second." Mirith pulled up the video feeds from the few surface cameras that were still functioning on Kelthera Prime. She watched as dozens of drop pods slammed into the ground around Vrexian positions, creating impact craters and throwing up huge clouds of dust and debris. Then the pods opened, and the humans emerged. The first thing that struck her was the size. Humans were larger than Keltherans, standing nearly twice as tall and far more heavily built. But it wasn't just their natural size. They wore armored suits that made them look like walking tanks. The armor was thick enough to stop any weapon the Keltherans possessed, studded with sensors and weapon systems. The Vrexian ground forces immediately opened fire on the humans. Their organic weapons should have overwhelmed the small number of armored. The battle for the surface of Kelthera Prime lasted 6 hours from the moment the first drop pods hit the ground. Major Amy Sullivan coordinated her 300 Marines with the efficiency of someone organizing a logistics operation rather than a combat mission. Every squad knew their objectives. Every soldier understood the mission parameters. And the Vrexians were learning a harsh lesson about the difference between fighting peaceful species and fighting Deathworlders. Lieutenant Katie Walsh monitored the combat through every functioning sensor she could access from the shelter. The human tactical network was partially visible on her systems, and what she saw was remarkable. The humans weren't just fighting, They were executing a precise military operation with multiple simultaneous objectives, coordinated timing, and backup plans for every possible complication. Squad leaders reported to Major Sullivan in calm, professional tones that seemed absurd given what they were doing. "Sullivan, this is Sergeant Dan Cooper, 3rd Squad. Building Complex 7 Alpha secured. 23 hostiles eliminated. No friendly casualties. Moving to Objective 7 Bravo. No friendly casualties." The phrase kept appearing in the reports Katie was monitoring. The humans were pushing through Vrexian positions that had seemed impenetrable, and they weren't losing anyone. A few reported minor damage to their armor, but nothing that slowed them down. It was like watching a training exercise where one side had all the advantages and the other side never had a chance. On the surface, Sergeant Cooper led his squad through the ruins of what had been a Keltheran residential district. The Vrexians had turned the area into a fortified position, with organic barriers and weapon nests covering every approach. Standard tactics would have required careful advancement, suppressing fire and coordinated assaults that would take hours. Cooper's squad simply walked through the position. Their armor's sensor systems identified every Vrexian soldier before the enemy even knew they were under attack. The humans' weapons fired with devastating accuracy, each shot eliminating a threat before the Vrexians could respond. The aliens tried to fall back to secondary positions, but the humans were faster, cutting off retreat routes and systematically clearing every building. Private Kevin Turner took point, his armor's shields absorbing sporadic Vrexian fire without even slowing him down. He kicked down a reinforced door that would have required explosives for most species to breach, his powered armor making the action trivial. Inside, 3 Vrexians tried to bring their weapons to bear. Turner's rifle fired 3 times and all 3 targets collapsed. "Room clear," Turner reported, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he had just checked a storage closet. He moved to the next door, his squad flowing behind him with practiced coordination. Captain Mirith listened to these reports with a mixture of awe and horror. The humans were efficient, professional, and utterly terrifying. They treated deadly combat like routine work, discussing the elimination of enemy forces the way her people might discuss filing reports or managing inventory. There was no hatred in their voices, no bloodlust or rage, just calm competence as they systematically destroyed an enemy that had seemed invincible. The second colony, Kelthera Secondary, presented a more complex problem. The Vrexians had managed to breach several major shelter complexes and were actively harvesting the civilian population when the human drop pods arrived. The tactical situation required speed and precision to prevent further civilian casualties. Lieutenant Greg Palmer commanded the ground force assigned to Kelthera Secondary. He was younger than most of his counterparts, having risen through the ranks quickly due to exceptional tactical skills and a calm demeanor under pressure. His orders from Captain Morrison had been clear: eliminate the Vrexian threat and minimize civilian casualties in that order. Palmer's force hit the ground and immediately split into rapid response teams. They identified the shelters under active assault and moved to intercept with a speed that defied their heavy armor. The Vrexians never had time to use the civilians as shields or hostages. The humans simply arrived too fast, hit too hard, and showed no hesitation. One shelter complex was particularly bad. The Vrexians had broken through the main entrance and were pushing deep into the underground tunnels, where thousands of Keltherans were trapped. Palmer personally led a team directly into the breach, his armor's lights illuminating the darkness as his soldiers moved through the narrow corridors. The Vrexians tried to set up defensive positions in the tight spaces, thinking the cramped quarters would neutralize the humans' equipment advantages. They were wrong. The human armor was designed for every environment, including shipboarding actions and underground combat. Palmer's team moved through the tunnels like water flowing downhill, unstoppable and inevitable. Katie received a transmission from Palmer's team as they pushed deeper into the shelter. She heard the sounds of combat in the background, but Palmer's voice was calm and focused. "Keltheran civilians, this is Lieutenant Palmer of the Earth Defense Force. We're clearing the hostile forces from your shelter. Stay in your secure rooms and away from the main corridors. We'll reach you soon." The Keltherans huddled in their sealed rooms, hearing explosions and weapons fire getting closer, then gradually fading as the humans pushed the Vrexians back toward the entrance. When Palmer's team finally reached the deepest sections of the shelter, they found hundreds of terrified civilians who had been moments away from being harvested. Palmer removed his helmet, revealing a young human face with dark hair and tired eyes. He smiled at the frightened Keltharans, trying to look reassuring despite the blood and debris covering his armor. "You're safe now. My team is securing the upper levels. We'll have medical personnel here within the hour." One elderly Keltharan, a female named Saria, who had lived through 2 previous crises in her long life, stared at Palmer with wide eyes. "You came for us. We're not even your people, and you came." Palmer's expression grew serious. Someone called for help. That's all that matters. He replaced his helmet and moved back toward the combat zone, leaving the civilians under the guard of 2 Marines while the rest of his team continued clearing operations. The 3rd colony, Kelthera Tertiary, presented the worst situation. The Vrexians had established their primary command center there, with the largest concentration of forces and the most heavily fortified positions. When they detected the human assault on the other 2 colonies, the Vrexian commanders on Tertiary made a calculated decision. They issued an ultimatum. Captain Morrison received the transmission on the bridge of the Valkyrie. The Vrexian commander's voice was harsh and alien, translated by the ship's computers. "Human vessels, you have interfered in Vrexian operations. We control significant civilian populations on this colony. If you continue your assault, we will execute all remaining captives. Withdraw immediately or accept responsibility for their deaths." Morrison stood on his bridge, surrounded by his crew, and felt a cold anger settle over him. He had commanded warships for 15 years, fought in conflicts across human-controlled space, and dealt with pirates, raiders, and hostile forces of every description. But threatening civilians to gain tactical advantage was a line he would not tolerate. He opened a channel to Admiral Blake, who was monitoring the operation from Earth. "Sir, the Vrexians are threatening to execute civilians if we don't withdraw. Requesting permission to implement Response Protocol 7. Blake's response came quickly. "Permission granted, Captain." "Make it clear." Morrison switched to a wideband transmission that would reach every Vrexian receiver in the system. His voice was cold and precise, carrying none of his usual warmth. "Vrexian forces, this is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Ship Valkyrie. Your ultimatum is rejected. If you harm a single civilian, we will eliminate every Vrexian military position in this system with orbital bombardment. You have 60 seconds to release your captives and surrender. This is your only warning." 60 seconds passed in tense silence on the Valkyrie's bridge. Morrison's tactical officer, Commander Lisa Harper, tracked the Vrexian positions with the ship's targeting systems. She had already calculated firing solutions for every enemy position on the colony's surface. The Valkyrie's main batteries were charged and ready. The Vrexians didn't surrender. Instead, they began executing captives, broadcasting the killings as proof of their resolve. They had miscalculated badly. They thought the humans would back down to save civilian lives, as most species would. They didn't understand that humans had a different calculation. Backing down would save some lives now, but teach the Vrexians that threatening civilians was an effective tactic. Morrison couldn't allow that lesson to take root. "Harper, commence orbital bombardment. Precision strikes only. Eliminate all Vrexian military positions." The Valkyrie's weapons spoke with a voice like thunder. Massive railguns fired tungsten penetrators from orbit, each one guided by sophisticated targeting systems. The projectiles hit with pinpoint accuracy, destroying Vrexian command centers, weapons depots, and troop concentrations. The bombardment lasted 3 minutes and eliminated 70% of the Vrexian ground forces on Tertiary. The remaining Vrexians, realizing their mistake too late, tried to retreat too. The morning after the liberation was strange and surreal for the Keltharans. They emerged from their underground shelters expecting to find their world in ruins, their people scattered, and an uncertain future ahead. Instead, they found human soldiers establishing security perimeters, human medical teams setting up field hospitals, and human engineers already beginning repair work on damaged infrastructure. Captain Mirith walked through what had been a combat zone just hours earlier. The bodies of Vrexian soldiers had been removed. The damaged buildings were being assessed for safety, and everywhere she looked, humans were working with efficient purpose. They moved with a casual confidence that seemed at odds with the violence they had inflicted the previous day. A large human medical ship had landed in the central plaza of the capital city. Dr. Nina Hayes, the chief medical officer of the human fleet, was overseeing the establishment of a full field hospital capable of treating thousands of patients. She was a tall woman with red hair tied back in a practical bun, wearing a uniform that marked her as a senior officer. Mirith approached the medical camp hesitantly. She had wounded civilians who needed care beyond what the Keltheran medical facilities could provide, after days of being cut off from supplies. Hayes noticed her approach and walked over with a warm smile that seemed strange on someone who had arrived on a warship. "You must be Captain Mirith. I'm Dr. Hayes. We're setting up to receive patients now. Please have your medical staff bring anyone who needs treatment. We've brought supplies for millions of people and equipment to handle most emergency situations." Mirith struggled to reconcile this friendly, caring doctor with the soldiers who had ruthlessly eliminated the Vrexians. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes. We have many wounded, and our medical supplies were nearly exhausted. But I have to ask, you came with warships. This level of humanitarian aid seems like it should have required a separate convoy." Hayes laughed, a warm sound that made Mirith relax slightly. "Every human military vessel carries extensive medical facilities and humanitarian supplies. We plan for the worst and hope for the best. Besides, we knew what we'd find here. The Vrexians don't exactly leave populations in good condition." Over the next several hours, Keltheran wounded began arriving at the human field hospital. The Keltheran doctors watched in amazement as human medical technology went to work. The humans had treatments and equipment that seemed almost miraculous by Keltheran standards. Injuries that would have been fatal or permanently disabling were treated with quick efficiency. One Keltheran doctor, a male named Varys, watched as Dr. Hayes used a device to knit broken bones in minutes, something that should have taken weeks of healing. "How is this possible? The speed of healing, the precision of your equipment, it's far beyond our capabilities." Hayes glanced up from her work with a slight smile. "We come from a harsh world, Dr. Varys. Our medical technology evolved out of necessity. On Earth, people can suffer terrible injuries and die quickly without proper care. We learned to develop fast, effective treatments because we had to. Our evolution made us fragile in some ways, so our technology compensates." The word Earth was still strange to Keltheran ears. They knew so little about humanity, despite these humans having saved their entire civilization. Mirith decided it was time to learn more about their rescuers. She requested a formal meeting with Admiral Blake, who had arrived on the surface that morning. Blake agreed immediately and suggested they meet in what had been the Keltheran government building. It was damaged but still standing, and human engineers had already restored power to most of it. When Mirith arrived, she found Blake waiting with just two other humans, Lieutenant Colonel Chris Bennett and a young Marine serving as security. Blake stood when she entered, a gesture of respect that surprised her. He was tall, like all humans seemed to be, with gray hair and eyes that held the weight of long experience, but his expression was kind, and when he shook her hand in the human fashion, his grip was gentle despite the obvious strength behind it. "Captain Mirith, thank you for meeting with me. I wanted to speak with you personally before we begin the longer process of rebuilding your colonies." They sat across from each other at a table that had somehow survived the invasion intact. Mirith looked at the Admiral for a long moment before asking the question that had been burning in her mind since the first human ship arrived. "Admiral Blake, why did you come with warships?" "We called for humanitarian aid, for evacuation support. We never expected a military response. We never expected anyone to actually fight the Vrexians for us." Blake leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "Because we understood what you were facing, Captain. You didn't need food and medicine first. You needed the threat eliminated. A relief convoy would have been destroyed before it could help anyone. We brought warships because that's what the situation required." Mirith's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "But you destroyed them so easily. The Vrexians were considered a major threat across this entire sector. They've conquered dozens of systems. Yet your fleet eliminated 40 of their ships in minutes and cleared all 3 colonies in a day. Are humans really that much more powerful than the rest of us?" Blake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a hint of something that might have been regret. "We're not more powerful, Captain. We're just different. Where we come from, everything is a threat. Earth is a high-gravity world with a thick, oxygen-rich atmosphere. Our weather is violent, our wildlife is deadly, and our own bodies can kill us in dozens of ways. We evolved in an environment that was constantly trying to eliminate us." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the human soldiers working below. "We became persistence predators. Do you know what that means? We couldn't outrun our prey or overpower them with strength, so we chased them until they collapsed from exhaustion. We didn't give up, we didn't stop, and we learned to work together because we had to. A single human is dangerous. Humans working together are nearly unstoppable. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett spoke up, his voice carrying the rough edge of a career soldier. Our military doctrine reflects our nature, Captain. We don't fight fair, and we don't give enemies second chances. We identify threats, apply overwhelming force, and eliminate problems completely. It seems brutal to most species, but to us it's just practical. Mirith absorbed this information, trying to understand. So humans are natural warriors. Your entire species is built for combat? Blake turned back to her with a sad smile. Not warriors, survivors. There's a difference. We fight because we evolved to overcome threats, but we don't seek out conflict. We build, we create, we explore. But when someone threatens innocent people, when we hear a distress call from beings who can't defend themselves, we respond. That's also part of who we are. We protect those who need protecting. Over the next several days, the Keltherans began to understand their rescuers better, through countless small interactions. The human soldiers who had seemed so terrifying in combat were remarkably gentle with civilians. They helped rebuild homes, played with Keltheran children despite the language barriers, and treated every Keltheran they met with respect and kindness. Lieutenant Katie Walsh had her own revelation when she met Sergeant Dan Cooper properly. The soldier who had efficiently cleared an entire district of enemy forces turned out to be a friendly young man who was fascinated by Keltheran culture. He asked her questions about their art, their music, their history, showing genuine interest and curiosity. Back on Earth, I studied alien cultures before joining the military, Cooper explained as they shared a meal in the temporary mess hall the humans had established. I never thought I'd actually meet any of you in person, let alone end up fighting to protect your world. It's strange how life works out. Katie stared at him in confusion. You study other cultures, you're interested in peace and learning. But you're also a soldier who killed dozens of enemies yesterday. How do you reconcile those things? Cooper's expression grew serious. They're not opposites, Katie. I study your culture because I value life and diversity and want to understand the galaxy we're all sharing. I'm a soldier because sometimes understanding isn't enough. Sometimes bad people do bad things and someone has to stop them. I'd prefer to never fire my weapon, but I train every day to be ready if I need to. That's the balance humans try to maintain. Similar conversations were happening across all three colonies. Humans and Keltherans were learning about each other, bridging the gap between two very different species. The Keltherans were beginning to understand that humans weren't conquerors or warmongers. They were protectors who happened to be very good at violence when it was necessary. Dr. Hayes had her own moment of cultural exchange with Dr. Varys. They were treating patients together when Varys asked about human physiology. Hayes pulled up comparative medical data on her tablet, showing him the differences between human and Keltheran biology. Your bones are 4 times denser than ours, Varys said in amazement. Your muscle mass is incredible. Your immune system is so aggressive it often attacks your own body. How do you survive with bodies that are constantly at war with themselves? 3 months after the liberation of the Kelthera system, the story of humanity's intervention had spread across known space like wildfire. The Galactic Council chambers on the capital world of Vestra buzzed with urgent debate as representatives from hundreds of species discussed the implications of what the humans had done. Councillor Threx of the Valatine Assembly stood before the gathered representatives. His multiple eye stalks focused on the display screens showing footage of the battle. The images were shocking to species who had spent centuries avoiding major conflicts. Rexian ships being torn apart in seconds, human soldiers walking through enemy fire like it was nothing, and an entire invasion force eliminated in less than a day. Honored council members, Threx began, his translator converting his chemical signals into standard galactic language. We must address the human question. They received a distress call from a species they had barely met, and responded with overwhelming military force. They didn't seek council approval, didn't attempt diplomatic solutions, and didn't negotiate with the aggressors. They simply arrived and destroyed everything in their path. Murmurs of concern rippled through the chamber. Many species were disturbed by humanity's direct approach to the problem. The galactic community had spent generations building careful diplomatic protocols for managing conflicts. The idea of simply showing up with warships and eliminating threats seemed dangerously aggressive. Councillor Vesh of the Taurian Collective raised a tentacle in objection. But Councillor Threx, the human, saved billions of innocent lives. The Keltherans would have been completely harvested by the Vrexians without intervention. Should we fault them for answering a distress call effectively? The debate raged for hours with no clear consensus forming. Some species viewed humanity as potential saviors, powerful allies who could finally stand up to aggressive forces like the Vrexians. Others saw them as dangerous wildcards who might upset the careful balance of galactic politics. A few quietly worried about what would happen if humanity ever decided other species were threats. The human representative to the Galactic Council was Ambassador Helen Cross, a career diplomat with decades of experience in interspecies relations. She had been watching the debate quietly, waiting for the right moment to speak. When Councillor Threx finally asked for her response to the concerns being raised, she stood calmly and addressed the chamber. Honored council members, I understand your concerns about humanity's actions in the Kelthera system. We didn't follow established protocols and we used force that many of you find excessive, but I ask you to consider the alternative. If we had followed standard procedures, requested council approval, and assembled a diplomatic mission, how many Keltherans would have died while we were discussing proper protocols? She activated her own display, showing casualty estimates. By the time a council-approved response could have been organized, the Vrexians would have harvested the entire population of all 3 colonies. 6 billion people would be dead or worse. Instead, because we acted immediately, civilian casualties were limited to approximately 800 million. That's still a horrific number, but it's billions fewer than would have died without intervention. Ambassador Cross looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of various counselors.
Humanity doesn't seek to dictate how the galaxy operates.
We respect your institutions and your diplomatic processes, but when we hear someone calling for help, when we know people are dying while we debate procedures, we act. That's who we are. If that makes us dangerous, then yes, we're dangerous. But we're dangerous to those who threaten innocence, not to peaceful species seeking to coexist. The session ended without a formal resolution, but the message was clear. Humanity was now a significant factor in galactic politics, whether the Council liked it or not. Their reputation as powerful warriors who protected their allies was spreading quickly, and the reactions were mixed across the galaxy. In the Vrexian Collective's central command node, a very different discussion was taking place. The Hive Masters had analyzed every piece of data from the Kelthera battle, and their conclusions were sobering. The humans had destroyed a significant Vrexian force without taking meaningful casualties. Their technology was superior, their tactics were aggressive and effective, and their soldiers seemed to have no fear of death. The eldest Hive Master issued a directive that would change Vrexian expansion plans. Humanity was to be avoided at all costs. Any system under human protection was off limits for harvesting operations. The Vrexians had conquered dozens of species over the past century by carefully choosing targets they could overwhelm. They had no interest in fighting enemies who could actually hurt them back. But not all galactic powers were as pragmatic as the Vrexians. In the deep regions of space controlled by the Zareth Empire, military commanders watched the footage from Kelthera with different eyes. They saw the humans as a potential threat to their own expansion plans, but also as a challenge to be overcome. The Zerath had built their empire through superior technology and ruthless military doctrine. They weren't afraid of these newcomers. Several smaller species and independent colonies inspired by the Keltheran rescue began reaching out to humanity for defensive alliances. The human response was consistent across all these requests. Earth's diplomatic corps, working with the military leadership, established clear criteria for alliances. Humanity would defend species who were peaceful, who respected sentient rights, and who were willing to work toward mutual cooperation. They weren't interested in simply accumulating client states or building an empire. Captain Jake Morrison, now Commodore Morrison after his promotion, was assigned to oversee the construction of humanity's first permanent deep space installation in Allied territory. The station was being built in the buffer zone between Keltheran space and the next sector over, positioned to respond quickly to threats in multiple systems. Morrison stood in the command center of the partially completed station, watching construction crews work in the void outside. Commander Lisa Harper, who had taken command of the Valkyrie after his promotion, had come to visit and discuss future operational plans. "It's strange," Harper said, looking at the displays showing the various ships and personnel moving around the construction site. 3 months ago, we were just another battle group doing patrols in human space. Now we're the foundation of an entire Allied defense network. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. We showed the galaxy what humans are capable of when we protect our friends. Now we need to prove we can be trusted with that capability. That's going to be harder than any battle. Back on Kelthera Prime, life was slowly returning to normal. The worst of the damage had been repaired, and the population was beginning to recover from the trauma of invasion and liberation. But the changes were permanent and visible everywhere. Human military advisors worked alongside Keltheran defense forces, training them in new tactics and helping them understand modern warfare. Human engineers were helping to redesign the defense fleet with more effective weapons and stronger hulls. Captain Mirith had been promoted to Planetary Defense Coordinator, overseeing the complete restructuring of Kelthera's military capabilities. She spent her days working with human advisors, learning how to think like a deathworlder, even though her species would never be able to match human physical capabilities. One of her regular partners was Major Amy Sullivan, who had stayed behind after the liberation to help establish the training programs. They were reviewing tactical simulations when Sullivan made an observation that struck Mirith as profound. "You're never going to fight like humans," Sullivan said bluntly. "Your species didn't evolve for combat, and your physical limitations are real. But you can learn to think strategically, to use force multipliers and to coordinate effectively. You don't need to be as strong as us. You just need to be dangerous enough that attacking you isn't worth the cost." Mirith absorbed this wisdom carefully. "You're teaching us to be predators even though we're naturally prey species." Sullivan shook her head. "No, we're teaching you to survive. There's a difference. Predators hunt because they need to eat. Survivors do whatever it takes to protect themselves and their people. You called for help once and we answered. But you can't rely on us showing up every time. You need to be able to defend yourselves." The training continued across all 3 colonies. Young Keltherans who would never have considered military service before the invasion were now volunteering in large numbers. They had seen what helplessness looked like, and they had seen what effective defense looked like. They wanted to be part of ensuring their people were never that vulnerable again. Lieutenant Katie Walsh was among those who benefited most from the human training programs. She had always been talented with sensors and communications, but the humans taught her to think tactically, to see patterns in data that indicated threats before they became critical. She worked closely with Sergeant Dan Cooper, who had become a good friend despite the species barrier. "Your people are learning fast," Cooper told her one day as they reviewed the progress of a training exercise. "You're not going to be as physically capable as human soldiers, but you're smart and adaptable. That counts for a lot." Katie smiled at the compliment. "We had good teachers." "And good,"